Settle in with us for this one, because it begins the way the best stories sometimes do. Not with a fortune, but with a folded piece of paper in a notary's back office in Sudbury, and a young woman trying not to let anything show on her face. Her name was Nettie Vair. She was 21 years old. She had $11.40 in the inner pocket of her coat, a brass type gauge her grandmother had pressed into her hand 3 years before, and a deed, newly stamped, legally sound, to a place called Ashwick that did not appear on any map the notary could produce. The notary, a careful man named Mr. Gossard, who wore a brown waistcoat and delivered bad news the way certain men do, as though it were someone else's fault, told her that Ashwick had been removed from the district land rolls in 1901, that no road the survey office acknowledged ran to it, that the half section was hers, legally, but that the county had ceased to recognize it as a place, and that he could not, in good conscience, tell her the land was worth the train fare north to see it. Nettie thanked him. She folded the deed and the letter, and set them in the same coat pocket where the type gauge lived, and she stood and put on her hat, and she walked out into the April wind without letting anything show on her face. That was what Agatha Poole had taught her to do. And Agatha Poole had been right about almost everything. Nettie had been born in a frame house at the edge of a mill town called Cartwright's Hollow, the younger of 2 children, and she had lost both parents to scarlet fever in the same hard autumn when she was 9 years old. Her brother Philip had been sent to their father's people in New Brunswick. Nettie had been sent north to her father's sister, a woman named Selma Carn, who ran a hand laundry out of her house near the rail yard in Sudbury, and who had already decided, before the girl arrived, that she would not allow sentiment to interfere with practicality. Selma was not cruel in any way that could be put into a letter or described to a magistrate. She fed Nettie. She gave her a room with a window. She sent her to school until Nettie was 12, and then, because the laundry needed more hands, and Selma had never seen the point of continuing a girl's education past what was strictly necessary, she did not send her back. Nettie pressed shirts, and wound the ringing rollers and hung linens on the long wire lines, behind the house, summer and winter, and she was given to understand that what she received in room and board was more than she had earned, and that gratitude was the appropriate response to this arrangement. The person who showed her something different was her mother's mother, Agatha Poole, who lived alone above her print shop on McPherson Street in Cartwright's Hollow, and who took the train to Sudbury once a month to collect Nettie for what she called a Saturday visit. Agatha was 67 when Nettie first came to Selma. She had run the Cartwright's Hollow Intelligencer, a 4-page weekly, more gazette than newspaper, for 31 years, first with her husband, and then alone after he died in 1889. She had small, ink-stained hands, and a way of looking at a document that made the document feel as though it had been waiting to be read properly. She taught Nettie to set type in a compositing stick, to space some quads and agate lines, to read a deed description and a survey map, to keep a double-entry ledger and understand why each column had to balance exactly. She taught her to fold paper along the grain, to trim a press sheet with a bone folder held flat, to lay out a column of text so that the eye moved through it without catching. She taught her to read a contract before signing it, and to notice what was missing from an agreement as readily as what was poorly written. She taught her, most of all, that the thing that does not match the rest of it is the thing that is trying to tell you something. The question is whether you are paying enough attention to hear it. When Nettie was 14, Agatha gave her a type gauge. It was a brass rule 4 inches long, calibrated in picas on one edge and agate on the other, with a sliding stop for measuring column depth. One corner carried a small nick in the metal from a time it had been dropped against the press iron. Agatha said it was the first tool she had bought with her own money when she was learning the trade at a print supplier's in Hamilton when she was 16, and that it had measured every column she had ever set since. She pressed it into Nettie's hand on the station platform, and she said only, "This tells you what is true and what is not. It does not guess." Nettie kept it in the inner pocket of her coat from that day on. Agatha died in the autumn Nettie turned 18, of a quiet failing of the heart that her doctor said had been coming for some time. The print shop was sold within the month to settle a debt Nettie had not known existed. Cousins she had met perhaps twice handled the arrangements. They gave Nettie a cameo brooch that had belonged to Agatha's mother, and told her, not unkindly, that there was nothing else. She went back to Selma's laundry, and she worked the next 3 years the way Agatha had taught her to work, fully, without waste, and with her attention on what she was actually doing, rather than on what she wished she were doing instead. Selma took nearly everything Nettie earned, for room and board and what she called household maintenance. Out of what remained, Nettie managed, over those 3 years, to save $11.40. Folded in a strip of muslin in the bottom of her mending basket, beside the type gauge, and a small photograph of Agatha standing at the press, and a folded page of a land survey description that Agatha had once used to teach her how to read one. She did not know, during those 3 years, that anyone beyond Selma's house was thinking of her at all. She did not know that a letter had been sent from a notary's office in Sudbury, addressed to her, at Selma's address. In January of that year, 9 weeks before the April morning, she found it. She found it on a Wednesday, when Selma sent her to the kitchen sideboard for a receipt book, and it was in the second drawer, under a tea towel, still sealed. She understood, from the seal and from the date on the envelope, that Selma had seen the return address and made a decision about it without opening it. Later Selma would say she had been meaning to mention it. She had not mentioned it. Nettie read the letter standing at the open drawer. She read it twice. Then she put it in her coat pocket next to the type gauge, slid the drawer closed, and went and found the receipt book and brought it to Selma. She did not say anything about it that day or the next. She spent those 2 days finishing the work she had been given. She pressed 14 shirts and a set of tablecloths on Thursday. She hung the heavy linens on Friday in a cold wind that dried them stiff as boards. She mended a buttonhole on a man's jacket that evening by the kitchen lamp. And while she worked, she thought, carefully and without hurry, about what she would need and what she could carry and what she had already decided. On Saturday morning, she came down before Selma was awake. She made the coffee, set the kettle, laid the breakfast out the way Selma preferred it. Cups warmed, bread cut and covered with a cloth, cream in the small white jug. Then she sat at the kitchen table with her mending basket on her lap, and she went through it carefully. 2 work dresses, folded small, 3 pairs of darned wool stockings, a nightdress, the cameo brooch she had not worn since Agatha's funeral, the photograph, the type gauge, the $11.40 in the muslin strip, the deed to Ashwick, the notary's letter. She went to find Selma in the parlor. She said she was leaving on the noon train. She said she had a property in the North Country and intended to see it. She said she was grateful for the roof. Selma looked up from her mending and said that Nettie was a fool if she thought a dead uncle's scrap of bushland was worth anything, and that she would not hold a position open. Nettie said she was not asking her to. Selma said she was owed 3 weeks of board. Nettie counted $1.60 onto the arm of Selma's chair, what she had calculated the 3 weeks came to at the rate Selma had always named. And she picked up the basket, and she put on her coat, and she walked out the front door without looking back at the house, and without slowing her step until she reached the station platform. The station master sold her a ticket north to a flag stop called Red Pine Junction, which was the nearest point the notary's letter had named. It cost $3.80. She boarded the afternoon train and took a seat on the west side, because the sun was east in the afternoon, and she did not want it in her eyes. The train smelled of wood smoke, and the particular cold metal smell of Northern Ontario railways in early spring. She set the basket between her feet, pressed her ankles against it, and watched Sudbury slide away past the window, the laundry behind Selma's house still visible. For a moment, the wire lines empty, the yard gray and wet. She did not watch it for long. The train ran north through Spruce and Muskeg, and the dark, still surfaces of lakes with no names on the passenger map. She ate a piece of bread she had put in the basket that morning, and drank from a tin cup the conductor filled for her twice. She did not speak to anyone. She slept briefly, and woke when the car swayed, crossing a trestle in the dark, and she put her hand inside her coat pocket, and touched the type gauge and slept again. She reached Red Pine Junction at 5 in the morning, stepping down onto a plank platform in the gray pre-dawn light. A station agent named Mr. Colbin, a weathered man who had lived along that line for 40 years, looked her over once and asked where she was headed. She said Ashwick. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said Ashwick was 11 miles east on the old lumber cut, and that nobody had asked him about it in going on 6 years. She asked if there was water on the road. He said there was a creek crossing at the 4-mile mark that ran clean. She thanked him, filled her canteen at the platform pump, shouldered her basket on a strap she had rigged herself, and walked east into the new light. She walked for 6 hours with one stop at the creek to drink and rest. The country changed as she went. Spruce thinning into poplar, poplar opening into a wider valley, and in the valley floor the dry bed of a creek that no longer ran, and along its bank the white trunks of birch trees still standing, still alive. At the far end of the valley, where the ground rose slightly, she saw the first sign of Ashwick, a post with rusted gate hardware, and no gate remaining. She walked down into the settlement slowly. 8 buildings stood. The foundations of 2 others lay open to the sky, a general store with its false front still upright and its sign long gone, a smithy, a squared log schoolhouse, a livery with half its roof caved in, 3 small houses, and 1 larger house set back from the track on a lot of its own, with the remains of a kitchen garden visible beneath the dead grass, and above the door, carved neatly into a cedar lintel. Vair, 1889. She set the basket on the step. She put her hand flat against the door, and felt the wood shift slightly under her palm, and she lifted the latch, and the door opened inward on hinges that groaned but held. The main room was perhaps 12 by 14 feet, with a plank floor and a fieldstone hearth and a pine table and 2 chairs. A shelf on the north wall held 3 tin cups, a cracked enamel basin, and a glass lamp with the wick long since dried out. A back room behind a canvas curtain held a rope bed frame, and a low pine chest painted blue, the paint blistered. Everything smelled of spruce resin and old ash and mouse, and under it all the clean mineral smell of a place that had not been damp in years. She stood in the middle of the room and touched the type gauge through her coat pocket and said aloud, to no one, that it would do. She went out to find the well, found it behind the house, with the rope still sound on the crank, and drew up water that came clear on the 3rd pull. She carried the bucket inside and set it on the table, and she began to sweep. She swept with a brush she made from a bundle of dead birch switches bound to a length of board she pried from the livery's fallen section. She worked for 2 hours, moving outward from the hearth. On the second pass, around the hearthstone, she noticed something she had not seen on the first. The mortar along the front edge of the hearthstone was a different color than the mortar at the sides and the back. Lighter, almost chalky, packed in with small finger-pressed plugs rather than laid evenly with a tool. Someone had done it in a hurry, or in poor light, or both. Agatha had told her, "The thing that does not match is the thing that is trying to tell you something. You have to decide whether you want to hear it." Nettie fetched the fireplace poker. She worked the tip into the seam along the front edge of the hearthstone, a flat granite slab perhaps 2 feet wide and 3 inches thick, and worked it back and forth with patience until the mortar crumbled in chalky flakes. She crouched and set both hands under the front edge and lifted. The stone came up in one piece and she leaned it against the wall. Beneath it, in a shallow cavity mortared on all 4 sides, sat a tin biscuit box painted with faded blue diamonds, and beside the box, a small oilcloth packet bound with waxed twine. She lifted the packet first. Inside the oilcloth was a leather envelope. Inside the envelope was money, a folded sheaf of banknotes, $60 worth, and a smaller fold of 38 silver dollars, which she counted twice, and beneath them a bank order on a branch in North Bay for $112, made out to bearer. She sat on the floor with her back to the hearth and held the money in both hands for a long moment, before she opened the tin box. Inside the box, folded over a small object, was a letter. 4 sheets of lined paper, written in a careful upright hand, with the deliberate spacing of a person who understood that whoever read it might be reading in poor light. And beneath the letter, wrapped in a square of flannel, was a brass type gauge. 4 inches long, calibrated in picas on one edge, agate on the other, with a sliding stop for measuring column depth. One corner carried a small nick in the metal. She held it in her left hand and reached into her coat pocket with her right and took out the one Agatha had given her. She set them side by side on her palm. They were the same length, the same calibrations, the same nick in the same corner, though this one was brighter at the sliding stop, less worn, as though it had been used less and preserved more carefully. She sat without moving while the afternoon light shifted across the floor. Outside, a jay called once from the birch trees and was not answered. Then she unfolded the letter and turned toward the window to read it. To whoever finds this, it began, "My name is Nettie Vair, and I lived in this house for 37 years. She read the letter through once in silence, and then she read it again aloud, in a low voice, the way Agatha had always read important documents, not performing, only attending. Nettie Vair had come to Ashwick in 1871 as the wife of a man named Hugh Vair, who had been a cousin of Nettie's great-uncle Clarence. Hugh had died in 1888. Robina had stayed. She had been the settlement's postmistress and its letter writer by turns, and had set type for the small gazette the settlement printed for 11 years on a hand, press brought in by wagon from Sault Ste. Marie. The type gauge had come with the press. Robina had kept it as Agatha had kept hers, and in the way Robina described using it, by feel as much as by measure, running her thumb along its edge to find the pica mark in the dark when the print shop lamp was low. Nettie understood without needing further explanation that the two women had learned the trade from the same tradition, had perhaps trained under the same people, and had carried the same small tool forward without ever knowing the other existed. Robina wrote that, in the summer of 1899, a timber company arrived with surveyors and a letter from the district land office claiming to survey for a mill access road that would bring trade and mail service north. What they had done instead, over the following winter, was drive test bores along the ridge north of the settlement, looking, Robina believed, for mineral deposits, and had fractured something in the bedrock that fed the wells on the north side of the creek. Within 8 months, the north wells had begun to taste of iron and sulfur. 2 children had been sick through much of that winter. One of them, a boy of 4 named Louis Durst, had not recovered. The company had paid someone in the district recorder's office to remove Ashwick from the land rolls, so that no formal title claim could be brought against the land or the water. The families had left between 1900 and 1902. Robina had stayed because she was old, and because the south wells, fed by the valley's own water table, still ran clean. She had set aside what she could from 37 years of small work for whoever came after. She hoped it would be a Vair. She hoped that Vair would carry the papers folded beneath the tintype to the provincial land office in Toronto, and asked that the removal of Ashwick from the county records be formally examined. Nettie found the papers where Robina had said they would be. A page from the district survey with the bore sites marked in pence, and in the margin, in Robina's careful hand, a company name and the name of the government clerk who had handled the removal. She set the papers on the table, beside the type gauge and the bank order, and the letter. Then she stood and went out to the step and looked at the evening light on the birch trees along the dry creek. The light was the particular gold of a northern Ontario evening in May, slow and without hurry, and the first birch leaves were just beginning to come, pale green, new, the size of a small coin. She understood, standing there, that she was not going anywhere. She slept that first night, on her coat folded on the floor, with the type gauge in her hand. In the morning she began. She repaired the rope bed with cord she braided from sackings she found in the livery. She patched the window with oiled paper cut to size. She mended the table's cracked leg with a wooden pin she shaped from a rail splinter and drove in with a stone. On the 4th day, a man came down the track on a gray horse and stopped at the gate and introduced himself as Weston Farr, 54, who ran cattle on the East Flat 6 miles distant and had seen her smoke. He read the deed she showed him slowly, and said he had known Clarence Vair, who had been a fair-dealing man, and that, if she meant to stay, he would send his hired man around with a cord of split poplar on Saturday. He did. The hired man was a quiet Métis man, named Gabriel Leroux, who stacked the wood along the north wall without being asked, and, without comment, rehung the livery's fallen door on a new set of pintles he had brought in his saddlebag. He would take nothing but coffee and the use of the well. The week after, a woman arrived from Red Pine Junction carrying a cloth bag and a cast-iron pan. Her name was Adeline Ferris, 62, the station agent's sister-in-law, who had heard from Mr. Colbin that a Vair girl had walked east into the bush alone and had decided to see for herself. She brought oats and salt pork and a bar of yellow soap, stayed the afternoon, showed Nettie how the south well gave water at 16 feet, and agreed that the north wells, which she tested by tasting, still carried a mineral edge that she did not like. Before she left, she wrote her name and the date on the inside of the pantry door frame in pencil, and told Nettie to do the same for everyone who came, so the house would keep its own account. Nettie did. A freighter named Paweł Skierko, 47, Polish by his father, hauling dry goods north on a 3-day run, stopped for water at the south well 2 weeks later, and stayed a day and a half to help raise the general store's collapsed rear wall, using a block and tackle he carried on his wagon. He refused payment, but accepted a jar of pickled beets. Adeline Ferris had sent up in her second visit and promised to stop whenever his route brought him through. A widow named Dora Meath, 40, who kept a small trap line 8 miles west, appeared one morning in June leading a nanny goat on a rope and said the goat was more than she needed and Nettie had the look of someone who could use the milk. Nettie wrote to the provincial land office in Toronto in the 5th week, enclosing a careful copy of Rovina's survey page, and the names from the margin, and a plain letter of her own asking that the removal of Ashwick from the district rolls in 1901 be formally examined. She kept the postage receipt in the ledger she had begun keeping, in 2 columns, the way Agatha had taught her, so that no one could later claim she owed what she did not. By the end of the 2nd month, the front room had a sound floor and a scrubbed table and 2 chairs, and a shelf where Robina's tin cups stood beside the refilled lamp, and above the hearth Nettie had set 2 small nails and hung the 2 type gauges side by side. Agatha's on the left, worn at the sliding stop from years of daily use. Robina's on the right, still bright, and on the mantel beneath them, the photograph of Robina at the press, and beside it the photograph of Agatha that Nettie had carried in her basket from Sudbury, and between the 2 photographs, a smooth river stone she had taken from the dry creek bed on her 2nd day. A small gray, ordinary stone that had no particular significance, except that she had wanted something from the land itself to be part of it. The 4 things together made a kind of record, and she touched them each morning before she went out to work. By autumn, people who came to Ashwick knew her name and used it without hesitation. Westenfar brought 2 laying hens in a slatted crate and would not hear of payment. Paul Skirko routed his northern run through the settlement once a month and paid 20 cents a night for the east stall of the livery and a hot supper. Gabriel Leroux arrived one October morning with a small hand press, a platen and screw affair he had found in a barn being cleared near Espanola, which he said he thought she might know what to do with. She did. A letter came from Toronto in November acknowledging receipt of her papers and confirming that a clerk had been assigned to review the 1901 removal. A second letter arrived in January, brief and administrative in its tone, stating that the removal had been found procedurally irregular and that Ashwick would be restored to the district land rolls at the next quarterly revision. Nettie folded both letters into Robina's tin box with the survey page and the deed, and set the box beneath the hearthstone, which she had reset with new mortar troweled in evenly, smoothly, so that it matched all the rest. She began printing a record of the settlement on Gabriel's rescued press. Not a newspaper, not yet. A single folded sheet she reset each month. She listed the names of the families who had lived in Ashwick and the years they had come and gone. She printed the name of Louis Durst and the name of a little girl named Helen who had survived the sick winter and gone south with her family. She printed the company name from Robina's survey page. She printed the government clerk's name beside it. She sent copies to the land office in Toronto and to the Sudbury paper and to the Cartwright's Hollow Intelligencer, which ran the piece in full under a new owner who understood what it was. On the inside of the pantry door frame, the pencil names had reached the edge of the frame and turned the corner and begun working their way down the wall toward the floor. On an evening in early spring, nearly a full year from the day she had stepped off the train at Red Pine Junction and walked east into the light, Nettie sat in the chair she had repaired and watched the fire settle in the hearth. The wind was small that night, the kind of still that comes off the shield in May before the black flies start, and the birch trees along the dry creek were beginning to show their first leaves, pale and new. The ink smell of that afternoon's print run still hung in the front room. She stood and went to the mantel and laid her hand flat against each of the 4 things in turn, the way she had done every morning of that year. The 2 photographs, the river stone, the 2 type gauges, side by side. She thought about Selma Carn and the drawer with the letter in it, and the 9 weeks it had sat there, unopened. She thought about her mother's cousins, who had sold the print shop and given her a brooch as though that were an accounting. She thought about these people without heat. They had looked at her and seen someone who could be used until she was used up. And they had been wrong about that. And the wrongness was complete in itself and required nothing further from her. The answer was the settlement around her. The 2 gauges on the wall. The press in the corner with its tray of type standing ready. The pencil names on the door frame that had turned the corner and started down the other side. She thought about Agatha Poole, who had taught her to read a deed and set a column of type and noticed the thing that did not match, who had pressed a brass tool into her hand on a station platform and said, "This tells you what is true and what is not." She thought about Robina Vair, whom she had never met, who had lived in this house for 37 years and had set aside what she could from 37 years of small work, and had wrapped it in flannel and placed it under a stone in the hope that whoever came next would carry a survey page to where it needed to go. Two women who had prepared something for someone they would never see, who had, between them, and without knowing it, made her. She sat back down in the chair. From the yard came the soft voice of Dora Meath's goat, settling for the night, and from somewhere past the birch trees the first frog of spring, calling once into the dark and being answered. We will leave Nettie Vair here tonight, with the fire low and the press inked and the name still growing on the pantry door. If this story sat with you the way a good fire does, slowly, warmly, long after you expected it to, take a moment to leave us a comment and tell us where you are watching from tonight. And while you are there, tell us this: who is the Agatha Poole in your own life? The person who handed you a tool or a skill or simply the belief that you were worth the teaching? And do you still carry it with you? We will be reading. Settle in, and we will see you at the next one.